The morning I decided to stop plowing Maple Crest Lane was the same morning the temperature dropped to 6 degrees Fahrenheit, and the National Weather Service issued a blizzard warning that used words like historic and potentially catastrophic, and do not travel unless absolutely necessary. 4 feet of snow was coming. The forecast had been plastered all over every local news channel for 3 straight days. Everybody in the neighborhood knew it was coming. Everybody had time to prepare. And yet, Sherry Radcliffe, the self-appointed queen of the Maple Crest Homeowners Association, had spent those exact 3 days not buying groceries or stacking firewood or double-checking her propane tank levels. No, she had spent those 3 days drafting a new HOA resolution and sliding it under every door on the lane, printed on official HOA letterhead with her name signed at the bottom in red ink like she was the president of a small country. I remember standing at my kitchen window that Thursday morning, coffee mug in hand, reading her little notice for the second time because I genuinely could not believe it the first time. The notice informed residents of Maple Crest Lane that, effective immediately, all gasoline-powered snow plow trucks were prohibited from operating within the boundaries of the Maple Crest HOA community. The stated reason, typed out in bold at the bottom of the page, was noise pollution, exhaust emissions, and the general aesthetic disruption caused by commercial snow removal vehicles. There was a fine listed, $250 per violation. And at the very bottom, almost as an afterthought, it said that residents were encouraged to use approved electric snow removal equipment or professional hand shovel services. Hand shovel services for 4 feet of snow. In a neighborhood where half the driveways were 60 feet long, I set my coffee down, pulled out my phone, and called my buddy Dave, who runs a small plowing business 2 towns over. Dave had been clearing Maple Crest Lane for 6 years. He did my driveway, the Hendersons next door, old Mr. Kowalski down the street, the Pattersons, and 4 other households on the lane. He was reliable, affordable, and he showed up at 2 in the morning when a storm was bad enough to warrant it. He had a big orange Chevy truck with a proper commercial blade, and he knew every inch of that lane by heart. "Rick," Dave said when he picked up, "I already got the notice. Somebody called my business line last night and said if I showed up on Maple Crest Lane they were going to report me to the HOA and that I'd be fined." I asked him who called. "Didn't leave a name," Dave said, but the voice sounded like a middle-aged woman who was very pleased with herself. Yeah, that sounded about right. I told Dave to hang tight and that I was going to look into this before the storm hit. He agreed but mentioned that if things weren't resolved in the next 24 hours, he'd need to shift his route planning because he had other clients to service, and he couldn't hold a slot open for a lane that might try to fine him just for showing up. That was fair. That was completely fair. Dave ran a business. He didn't have time for HOA theater. I went and dug out my copy of the Maple Crest HOA covenants, conditions, and restrictions. It was a thick document, the kind of thing most people sign and throw in a drawer and never look at again. I was not most people. When I moved into Maple Crest 4 years ago, I had actually sat down and read the whole thing because I'd heard stories about HOAs, and I wanted to know exactly what I was signing up for. I had also, at the advice of a real estate attorney friend of mine, highlighted several key passages and written notes in the margins. It took me about 20 minutes of flipping through pages to find what I was looking for. Article 7, Section 4 of the covenants dealt with community services and utilities. There was a clause in there that had been in the original document since the community was built in 1987. It stated specifically that the HOA board could not enact rules that interfered with residents' rights to access essential services, including but not limited to snow and ice removal during declared weather emergencies. The county had, in fact, issued a weather emergency declaration the previous afternoon. It was sitting right there on my phone from the county alert system. Snow emergency. Declared. Official. So Sherry Radcliffe had just enacted a rule that was almost certainly in direct conflict with the existing covenants, and she did it 24 hours after a snow emergency was declared. The timing was either spectacularly incompetent or spectacularly malicious. With Sherry, honestly, it could have been either one. I needed to make a few calls, and I needed to do it fast because the storm was already starting. The first flakes were coming down outside my window, light and dry and deceptively innocent looking. By midnight they were going to be coming down sideways. My first call was to Linda Patterson, who lived 4 houses down, and who was probably the most level-headed person in the entire neighborhood. Linda was a retired paralegal, and she had a photographic memory for rules and regulations. She had run for the HOA board twice and lost both times, which everyone suspected was because Sherry had somehow engineered the vote results, though nobody could ever prove it. "I already read it," Linda said before I even finished my first sentence. "It's not enforceable. They needed a full board vote for a rule change like this, and there are 5 board members. Sherry is only one of them." I just got off the phone with Frank DeLuca, and Frank says he never voted on any such resolution. Neither did Carol Whitmore. So Sherry had unilaterally issued this rule without a proper board vote. She had put it on HOA letterhead, signed it, and distributed it to the entire neighborhood as if it were official policy, when in reality it was just Sherry doing whatever she felt like doing and using the HOA's name and authority to back it up. That was not just procedurally wrong. Depending on how a lawyer looked at it, it could be considered fraud. Using an organization's official credentials to misrepresent unofficial actions as official ones. I didn't want to jump ahead of myself, but I filed that thought away. Linda told me she was going to reach out to the other legitimate board members and get them on record that no vote had taken place. I told her about the covenant clause I'd found regarding essential services during weather emergencies. She made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sigh. "Sherry didn't read the covenants," Linda said. "She never does. She makes it up as she goes and counts on the fact that most people won't push back. Most people, not me. I spent the rest of that morning documenting everything. I photographed the notice. I photographed the county weather emergency declaration on my phone screen. I pulled up a digital copy of the covenants and screenshotted the relevant section. I drafted a short letter to the HOA board, addressed formally to all 5 members, outlining the procedural failure, the covenant conflict, and the existence of the declared weather emergency. I emailed it to every board member whose contact info I had, which was all of them, because the HOA directory was technically a public document for residents. Then I texted Dave and told him that I believed the rule was not legitimate and that the HOA board did not properly authorize it, but that I completely understood if he didn't want to risk showing up and getting into a dispute. I told him I'd hold him harmless from any HOA fine personally if he got hit with one, and that I'd fight it on his behalf. Dave texted back a thumbs up and a snowflake emoji and said he'd be there at midnight as planned. Good man. Now here is where the story should have ended, really. If Sherry had simply been wrong and embarrassed and backed down, the whole thing would have been boring. But Sherry Radcliffe did not do boring. Sherry Radcliffe was a woman who escalated. By 2 in the afternoon, with about 3 inches of fresh snow already on the ground and more coming fast, Sherry had apparently read my email to the board and she was not happy. I know this because she showed up at my front door. I have a video doorbell and I have it set to record, and I want you to keep that fact in mind because it becomes important later. She was wearing a heavy down coat in bright yellow, which somehow perfectly suited her energy, and she was holding a clipboard, which she was not actually using for anything but which I think she carried as a prop to make herself feel more official. She knocked twice and then immediately tried the door handle, which was locked, before I even had a chance to walk over from the kitchen. I opened the door. The cold air rushed in immediately, sharp and biting. "Rick," she said, in that tone she used, the one that made your name sound like an accusation. You sent an email to the board members that was inappropriate and designed to undermine HOA authority. I sent an email explaining that the rule you posted wasn't properly authorized, I said. Which is accurate. I am authorized as HOA president to take emergency action. That's for actual board emergencies, not for preemptively banning snow plow trucks before a blizzard. She shifted the clipboard to her other arm. The community has agreed that we want a quieter, cleaner neighborhood experience, and commercial gas-powered trucks are not in keeping with that. The community did not vote on this, I said. You didn't even call a board meeting. Frank DeLuca told Linda Patterson he never heard about this resolution until he got the same notice the rest of us got. That's not how HOA governance works, Sherry. Her face did something complicated. Frank is not always available, and decisions sometimes need to be made quickly. In the 24 hours before a declared blizzard emergency, you urgently needed to ban the people who plow our snow. She straightened up. If your plow truck shows up on this lane, I will personally document it and issue a fine. Feel free, I said. And when you do, I'll be attaching the documented covenant violation to my appeal, along with the county emergency declaration, along with the emails from the board members confirming no vote took place, and I'll be forwarding the whole package to the County Housing Authority as an example of an HOA officer misusing organizational authority. There was a pause. The snow was coming down harder now, swirling around her yellow coat. You're being very aggressive about this, Rick. I'm being very clear about this, Sherry. Those are different things. She left. And I genuinely thought that was the end of it. I thought she'd go home, look up the covenant, realize she'd overstepped, and quietly let the whole thing die. Maybe send a follow-up notice retracting the rule. Maybe pretend none of it ever happened. Instead, at around 10 that night, with 8 inches of snow already on the ground and the storm just getting cranked up, Sherry Radcliffe did something that crossed a very clear line. I got a call from Dave. His voice was tight. Rick, I just got a message from someone claiming to be from the HOA saying that if I plow Maple Crest Lane tonight, my business license will be reported to the state for operating in a residential area without proper HOA approval, and that they have the authority to have my license reviewed. That was a lie. HOAs have no authority over state business licenses. None. That's not remotely how any of that works. But it was a convincing-sounding threat to someone who wasn't a lawyer, and Dave, understandably, was rattled. That's not true, I told Dave. They cannot do that. That is not a thing that is within their power. I figured it was probably nonsense, Dave said. But Rick, man, I can't afford a licensing dispute even if it's baseless. The investigation alone, even if I win, costs me time and money. And there it was, the real strategy. Sherry wasn't actually going to get Dave's license pulled. She probably knew she couldn't. She just needed to threaten it convincingly enough that Dave would back off. Because a threat you don't have to follow through on is just as effective as a real one, if the other person doesn't know the difference. I told Dave to give me 30 minutes. I called my friend Marcus, who happened to be a property attorney and who I had helped move furniture into his new house 2 summers ago, which meant he owed me at least one favor. Marcus picked up on the second ring, which I appreciated given that it was 10 at night during a blizzard. I explained the situation in about 4 minutes. Marcus made a sound that was a mix of irritation and professional interest. Okay, he said. First, she's dead wrong about the business license. HOAs have no jurisdiction over state commercial licensing. Second, making a false claim to a business owner that their license will be reported or reviewed in order to coerce them into abandoning a legitimate contract is potentially tortious interference. Third, if she put that threat in writing, she may have just handed you something significant. She sent it as a message to Dave's business contact form, I said. So yes, it's in writing. There was a pause. Tell your plow guy to save that message. Screenshot it, forward it to himself, and make absolutely sure it doesn't disappear. And tell him I can send him a 1-paragraph letter tonight on my firm's letterhead that he can wave at anyone who tries to threaten his license, explaining that the claim has no legal basis. Marcus was a good man. I would help him move furniture again any time. I called Dave back. He was relieved, agreed to save the message immediately, said he'd wait for Marcus's letter, and confirmed he was still coming at midnight. The storm was absolutely raging now, howling wind, blowing snow, the whole dramatic production. The streetlights on Maple Crest Lane were barely visible through the white. I could see from my window that the snow was already past my porch steps. Midnight came. I heard Dave's truck before I saw it, that familiar rumble of the diesel engine and then the scrape of the blade on asphalt. I watched from my window as he made his first pass down the lane, headlights cutting through the wall of snow, orange emergency lights spinning on the cab roof. It was honestly a beautiful sight in that moment. Exactly what you want to see in the middle of a blizzard. He did my driveway first, then worked his way down, doing the Hendersons, then the Kowalski place, then the Pattersons. It took him about an hour and a half for the whole lane, working methodically, doubling back to push snow off to the sides where it accumulated. By the time he was done, it was almost 2 in the morning and the snow was still coming hard, but the lane was passable, and everyone's driveways were clear enough to be functional. And then he left. I went to bed. When I woke up at 7 in the morning to about a foot of additional snow on top of what had already accumulated overnight, there was a handwritten note tucked under the edge of my front door. It was from Sherry Radcliffe. It informed me that she had documented the plow truck's presence the previous night, that she was issuing a formal fine to my household of $250, and that she was filing a complaint against Dave's business with the state contractor board. I photographed the note. I also checked my doorbell camera footage and found a timestamp of 5:47 in the morning showing Sherry Radcliffe walking up to my door in the dark, and the snow to slip the note under my door. Just that image alone, of her trudging through 1.5 feet of snow in the pitch dark before 6 in the morning to harass a neighbor, told you everything you needed to know about where her priorities were at. Now here is the part where I made the decision that, in retrospect, was either brilliant or petty, depending on who you ask. I prefer to think of it as educational. Dave had asked me the night before whether I needed him to come back for a second pass later in the day to clean up the overnight accumulation. I had said yes, of course. Normally, I would have said yes without a second thought, because we were in the middle of a historic blizzard and the snow wasn't stopping. But that morning, standing in my kitchen with Sherry's note in my hand and 4 feet of total snowfall either on the ground or in the forecast for the next 12 hours, I made a different call. I texted Dave and told him not to come back to Maple Crest Lane. I told him I was invoking his services only for my property and specifically not for the lane itself. He confirmed. I told the Hendersons and the Pattersons and old Mr. Kowalski what was happening. They all agreed that if the HOA wanted to play games, fine, but they'd each handle their own driveways with what they had. Mr. Kowalski had a small electric snowblower. The Hendersons had a powerful battery-operated unit they'd bought the previous winter. The Pattersons had teenage sons who could shovel in shifts. But the lane itself, Maple Crest Lane, the actual road that connected everyone to the main road. Nobody was plowing that. And here's the thing about Maple Crest Lane. It was a private road. The town did not plow it. The HOA was responsible for maintaining it. That responsibility had always been handled by contracting out to plowing services, which was why the HOA collected dues in the first place. A portion of every resident's dues went toward exactly this, maintaining the private road in winter. If the HOA banned the plow trucks, the HOA was going to have to figure out how to clear the road some other way, or not. And if not, the road was going to fill up with snow. 4 feet of snow. I sat back, drank my coffee, and watched it pile up. By noon on Friday, with the storm still dumping snow at a rate of about 2 to 3 inches per hour, Maple Crest Lane was impassable. It was a wall of white. You could not see the lane markings. You could barely see where the lane ended and the yards began. There were no tire tracks because nobody had tried to drive it since Dave's truck the night before. And Sherry Radcliffe's house was at the far end of the lane. I want to be clear about something. I did not set out to trap Sherry Radcliffe in her house. What I set out to do was demonstrate the natural consequence of banning snow plow trucks from a private road during a historic blizzard. The fact that Sherry lived at the end of the lane and therefore would be the most thoroughly sealed in was simply geography. I did not choose where she lived. By mid-afternoon on Friday, I started getting calls from neighbors. Some were calling to commiserate. Some were calling because they'd heard that the HOA had banned the plow trucks and they wanted to know if that was really true. Some were calling because they were genuinely worried about the road conditions and wanted to know what was going to happen. I answered everyone honestly. Yes, the HOA had issued a rule banning gas plow trucks. No, the rule had not been properly authorized by the full board. Yes, I had notified the board members of this. No, the HOA had not retracted the rule. Yes, as a result, the lane was not being plowed and was currently under 4 feet of accumulated snow. Yes, I thought this was a problem the HOA should solve. One of those calls was from a woman named Greta Sorensen, who lived on the main road just outside the Maple Crest entrance, and who was not technically in the HOA, but who knew everyone on the lane and who also happened to work for the local newspaper as a feature writer. She had heard from a friend that the lane was completely buried and that the HOA had caused it. She asked if she could come by and take some photos. I said absolutely, though I warned her the main entrance to the lane was also under about 3 feet of drifted snow and she might want good boots. Greta showed up in knee-high rubber snow boots, a heavy parka, and a very good camera. She took photos of the lane from the entrance, which looked like the surface of a snow-covered planet with no signs of civilization. She took photos of the fine notice I'd received. She photographed the notice Sherry had originally distributed. She asked me a few questions. I answered them. I showed her my email correspondence with the board members confirming no vote had taken place. She took notes on all of it. Then she asked if she could try to walk down to the end of the lane. I said I wouldn't recommend it. 4 feet of snow was not exactly a casual stroll. But she said she had good boots and she was from Minnesota originally, so she'd be fine. She came back 20 minutes later with photos of Sherry's house, which was completely inaccessible. The driveway was buried. The cars in the driveway were buried up to their door handles. The front walk was buried. The whole end of the lane looked like a snow globe that someone had shaken and then set down and forgotten. Greta took a photo of Sherry's mailbox sticking out of the snow with only the very top visible. That photo would later become the lead image for Greta's article. I had not been aware, until Greta mentioned it as she was leaving, that Sherry had actually attempted to drive out earlier that afternoon. Greta had seen the evidence of it, tire tracks going about 8 feet out of the garage, and then stopping in a wall of packed snow. Sherry had apparently tried to back her SUV out, hit the snowpack, and given up. The tracks were already filling in with fresh snow. Sherry was, for all practical purposes, sealed in. Now, I was not heartless about this. I want to be very clear on that. I knew Sherry had food because she was a homeowner who had been watching the same blizzard forecast as everyone else. I knew she had heat because her lights were on, and I could see smoke from her chimney. She was not in physical danger. She was in the same situation she had created for every other resident on the lane by banning the trucks that would have prevented it. She was experiencing the natural consequence of her own decision. But I did check. I'm not a monster. I called Linda Patterson and asked her to try to reach Sherry by phone just to confirm she was okay. Linda called and reported back that Sherry had answered, was fine, was very warm inside, and was, in Linda's words, extremely unhappy about the lane. Good. That meant she was healthy enough to be unhappy about things. Friday night, the storm started to ease up. By Saturday morning, it had stopped entirely, and the sun came out brilliant and blinding over 4.5 feet of accumulated snow. Maple Crest Lane was a spectacular sight from the air. I imagined, just a perfectly preserved trench of white with no interruption of any kind. I made my coffee, called Dave, and told him I wanted him to come do my driveway and the individual driveways of the neighbors who had signed on with him. Just the driveways, not the lane. I was very specific about that. Dave arrived at 9 on Saturday morning, and he did the driveways one by one, working efficiently down his list. The neighbors could at least get to their own garages. But the lane itself remained untouched, a pristine wall of snow that effectively meant nobody on it was going anywhere. At around 10 Saturday morning, I got a phone call from Frank DeLuca, one of the legitimate board members. "Rick," Frank said, "I need to talk to you about the lane." "Sure," I said. "People are calling me. They can't get out. This is a real problem." "It is," I agreed. "It's the problem that happens when you ban snow plow trucks during a blizzard." Frank exhaled. "You know I didn't vote on that resolution." "I know. I appreciate that you went on record about it. I've been trying to reach Sherry all morning. She's not returning my calls." I mentioned that Linda had confirmed Sherry was home and fine as of Friday afternoon. Frank said he knew that Carol Whitmore had also spoken to her, but that Sherry was apparently refusing to retract the resolution and was insisting the board had the authority to ratify it retroactively. I thought about that for a moment. "That's not really how retroactive ratification works in a governance context," I said, "especially when the resolution may have already caused harm." "I know," Frank said. "Rick, what would it take to get your plow guy back on the lane?" "A written retraction of the resolution, signed by a proper board majority," I said. "And a written acknowledgement that the fine issued to my household is void and will not appear on any HOA record." Frank said he would see what he could do. What he could do, as it turned out, was quite a lot when 3 of the 5 board members were working together, and 2 of them were also stuck on the lane. Carol Whitmore lived on Maple Crest Lane too, toward the middle, and she was also fully snowed in. She and Frank had been texting back and forth all morning, and were both completely fed up with the situation. By noon on Saturday, Frank had drafted a 1-page board resolution retracting Sherry's noise ordinance ban on gas plow trucks, noting that it had not been properly authorized by a board majority vote, noting that it was in conflict with the covenant clause regarding essential services during declared emergencies, and formally voiding any fines issued under its authority. He sent it to me by email along with a photo of the signed document. It had 3 signatures on it. His, Carol's, and a 3rd board member named Ray Domings, who lived outside the lane on one of the connector streets, and who had been following the whole situation by text all weekend, and who signed it just to make sure they had a majority. I called Dave. He was back on Maple Crest Lane within the hour. I stood at my window and watched that orange Chevy truck come rolling down from the main road, blade down, snow flying, and I felt something that I can only describe as profound satisfaction. Not mean satisfaction, righteous satisfaction. The kind you feel when a thing that should happen finally happens because you did what it took to make it happen. Dave took 3 passes down the full length of the lane, pushing the accumulated snow off to the sides and building impressive berms along both edges of the road. It took him almost 3 hours because of the sheer volume. When he was done, the lane was clear, properly clear, down to a thin layer of packed snow that would compact and clear further with traffic. All the way down at the end, I watched Sherry's garage door open for the first time since the storm. Her SUV backed out slowly, crept down the cleared lane, and disappeared around the corner without stopping. She did not wave at anyone. She did not acknowledge what had happened. She just left. I expected that to be the end of it. I really did this time. But the article Greta Sorensen had written went up on the newspaper's website Saturday afternoon, and by Sunday morning it had been shared widely enough that it had reached the regional news aggregators, and from there it had gotten a fair amount of attention. The article was factual and balanced, but it contained the photographs, including the one of Sherry's mailbox sticking out of the snow like a little flag of surrender, and it explained clearly what had happened. An HOA officer had unilaterally banned snow plow trucks without a board vote during a declared weather emergency in conflict with existing covenants, and had then made threatening calls to a local business owner about their license. That last part was the part that made things complicated for Sherry. Because Marcus, my attorney friend, had sent Dave the letter he'd promised on firm letterhead, explaining that the HOA had no jurisdiction over state business licenses, and that the threatening communication Dave had received was without legal basis. And Dave, being a practical man, had forwarded that letter to a friend of his who happened to be a deputy in the county sheriff's office, just to have on file, along with the screenshot of the original threat message. I found out on Sunday afternoon that the deputy had passed the information along to a colleague in the county's business crimes unit, not because anyone had filed a formal complaint yet, but because the deputy had looked at the screenshot and thought it merited at least a conversation. By Monday morning, a detective named Hargrove had reached out to both Dave and to Marcus to understand the situation. Dave walked him through it. Marcus provided his professional assessment that the communication constituted a potential case of tortious interference and possibly harassment of a licensed business operator, depending on how aggressively the county wanted to look at it. I found out all of this secondhand through Dave, who called me Monday morning sounding a mix of stressed and oddly excited. "Rick," he said, "I think this might have gotten bigger than either of us intended." I agreed that it had. Detective Hargrove called me directly on Monday afternoon. He was polite and professional and asked me to walk him through my side of the events in chronological order. I did. I referenced the doorbell camera footage of Sherry at my door, the photographs I'd taken of the notes and notices, the emails I'd sent to the board, the email response from Frank DeLuca, the signed board resolution retracting the rule. I had documented everything as it happened, and I sent him copies of all of it within the hour. On Tuesday morning, Detective Hargrove showed up at Sherry Radcliffe's house. I did not see this happen because her house was at the far end of the lane, but I heard about it from Linda Patterson, who had seen the unmarked car go by. Linda, who was a former paralegal and found law enforcement activity genuinely interesting, had noted the time. I got a text from Frank DeLuca at around 2 in the afternoon. "Detective spoke with Sherry this morning. She's confirmed the threatening call to Dave's business was made from her personal phone." I sat with that for a moment. She had actually done it from her personal phone, not even an anonymous line, her own phone. What followed over the next week was not a dramatic arrest scene or a perp walk, because real life is usually less cinematic than that, but it was significant in its own way. The detective determined that the communication to Dave's business constituted harassment and an attempt to coerce a licensed contractor through fraudulent misrepresentation of legal authority, which under the county's regulations qualified as a misdemeanor offense. Sherry was formally cited and required to appear in county court. Her appearance in court was on a Thursday morning 3 weeks after the blizzard, and while I wasn't there personally, Marcus was, because Dave had asked him to attend in a supporting capacity. Marcus told me afterward that Sherry had shown up with a personal attorney of her own and had clearly expected the matter to be dismissed. Instead, the judge, who Marcus said seemed to have very little patience for the specific flavor of nonsense this case represented, accepted the county's citation, read the documentation including Dave's screenshot and the attorney's letter, and found the harassment charge substantiated. Sherry Radcliffe was ordered to pay a fine of $800, ordered to submit a written formal apology to Dave's business, and placed on a 12-month conditional period during which any further substantiated harassment complaint would result in escalation to a criminal charge. She was not arrested, which is appropriate because no one wanted to make her a martyr and the goal was accountability, not spectacle. The HOA situation was resolved separately and in some ways more satisfyingly. The board held a proper meeting, a real one with all 5 members present and minutes taken, in early February. At that meeting, they formally reviewed the events of the blizzard weekend, formally voted to nullify the noise ordinance resolution Sherry had issued, formally confirmed that no fines issued under that resolution had any legal standing, and then, by a vote of 4-1, voted to remove Sherry Radcliffe from her position as HOA president on the grounds of acting outside her authorized authority and using HOA resources, specifically the letterhead and the board title, to misrepresent unofficial actions as official policy. She remained on the board as a regular member because removing a board member entirely required a homeowner vote, and nobody wanted to hold a special election in February. But she was no longer president. Frank DeLuca was elected acting president by the board for the remainder of the term, and he immediately announced that one of his priorities was reviewing and clarifying the HOA's governance procedures to prevent one officer from acting unilaterally on matters that required board consent. Linda Patterson, in the meantime, had taken detailed notes on every procedural failure throughout the whole event and had drafted a proposed amendment to the HOA bylaws that would require a formal supermajority vote for any rule changes affecting essential services. The board adopted it unanimously at their March meeting. Linda also finally got the board seat she'd been running for, filling a vacancy that opened up when Ray Domings announced he was moving to be closer to his grandchildren in the spring. She ran unopposed and won. Technically, she still ran unopposed even when uncontested, because she was principled that way and wanted the vote on record. Old Mr. Kowalski sent me a plate of homemade kielbasa as a thank you for the whole situation. He said, in the particular combination of directness and warmth that he always brought to things, that it was about time someone stood up to that woman, and he was glad I had decent documentation. He also told me that his small electric snowblower had performed admirably during the blizzard weekend, and that he had no complaints about battery-powered equipment in general. He just resented being told what kind of snow removal to use by someone who had never shoveled a day in her life. He had a point. Dave's plowing business, for its part, actually picked up some new clients in the aftermath of all this. Greta's article had mentioned his company by name in a positive context, noting that he was a reliable local contractor who had been on the receiving end of false legal threats, and several people in neighboring communities who needed plowing services had reached out to him. He called me a month after the whole thing to tell me he'd added 4 new regular clients to his winter route and that his winter revenue was up noticeably over the previous year. He was philosophical about the whole thing. "Best advertising I never paid for," he said. I told him I was glad something good came out of it. He said absolutely, and also that he was glad nobody had actually challenged his license because even baseless things like that were stressful, and he appreciated Marcus's letter more than he could express. I told him to buy Marcus a bottle of something nice. Dave said he already had. The blizzard itself, once it was over, was genuinely impressive in retrospect. The county recorded it as the 3rd largest single snowfall event in the region's recorded history. 4 feet and 3 inches of total accumulation over 36 hours. There were news segments about it. There were photographs posted everywhere of buried cars and snow drifts taller than houses and people skiing down normally busy streets. Maple Crest Lane made a brief appearance in a local news segment about HOA controversies during extreme weather, illustrated by Greta's photograph of the mailbox, and accompanied by a segment about the resolution and the subsequent board action. Sherry, to her credit, did not appear in any media. She declined all comment requests, which was probably the wisest decision she made throughout the entire ordeal. Spring came eventually, as it always does, and Maple Crest Lane thawed out, and the snow berms along the sides of the road slowly shrank, and then disappeared, and the grass came back greener than ever. The conversations about the blizzard weekend faded into neighborhood folklore, the kind of story people tell at summer barbecues while gesturing vaguely at the end of the lane and saying, "Remember when Sherry tried to ban the plow trucks?" I had one more interaction with Sherry that year that I think is worth mentioning, not because it was dramatic, because it wasn't, but because it was honest in a way that surprised me. It was a warm April evening, and I was out in my driveway rinsing off the salt deposits from winter with a garden hose, just one of those ordinary end-of-winter chores that feels oddly satisfying after months of ice and cold. Sherry walked by on the lane, which she sometimes did for her evening walk, and she slowed down slightly when she saw me. I expected her to keep walking. Instead, she stopped. She looked at me for a moment with an expression I had not seen on her face before. Not friendly exactly, but not the aggressive performance she usually brought to every interaction. "The lane needed those trucks," she said. It wasn't quite an apology, but it wasn't an argument either. It was a statement of fact delivered in a tone that acknowledged something. "Yes," I said, "it did." There was a pause, the sound of water from the hose, birds somewhere in the trees, a kid on a bicycle going by at the far end. "I went too far with the phone call," she said. The words came out like they cost her something, which they probably did. "You did," I said. She nodded once, a small, precise nod, and then she kept walking. And that was that. Not a friendship, not a resolution in any warm, fuzzy sense, but an acknowledgement. Two adults who lived on the same lane, understanding what had happened and where the lines were now drawn. I watched her walk all the way to the end of the lane and around the corner, and then I went back to rinsing salt off my driveway. The HOA met through that spring and summer with considerably less drama than it had in years. Frank was a fair and practical president. Linda asked smart questions at every meeting and kept meticulous minutes. The lane was properly maintained throughout mud season and into summer, with a contracted landscaping service handling the grass cutting and curb maintenance. When it came time to re-sign the plowing contract for the following winter, Dave was offered a 2-year deal at a slightly better rate than before, which he accepted. He showed up the following November to do a calibration run on the blade settings before the first real snow, just driving slowly down the lane and back to check clearances. I happened to be outside getting firewood from the stack beside my garage when he came by, and he stopped for a moment and rolled down his window. "You think we're going to have any excitement this winter?" he asked with a grin. "Hopefully just the weather kind," I said. He laughed and drove off, and I stacked the last of the firewood, checked the sky, which was the particular shade of gray that means something is coming, and went inside to put the kettle on. The whole thing, start to finish, came down to a few simple facts that Sherry Radcliffe had either not known or not respected. Private communities have governance documents for a reason. Those documents exist to protect every resident, including the ones on the board. Rules have to be made the right way or they don't count, and some services are not optional experiments in aesthetic preference. Some services are the thing that keeps 4.5 feet of snow from sealing your entire neighborhood in for a weekend. I kept the copy of Sherry's original notice, the one she'd printed on HOA letterhead and slid under my door in the dark at 5:47 in the morning. I kept it in the folder with all the other documentation, the emails, the board resolution, the covenant excerpt, the county emergency declaration. Not because I thought I'd need it again, but because it was a good reminder. Document everything. Know your covenants. Be ready to be patient while natural consequences do their work. And never, under any circumstances, try to stop the plow trucks when 4 feet of snow is on the way. The winter after the Great Maple Crest blizzard was actually relatively mild, only a few significant snowfalls, nothing historic, nothing that tested anyone's resolve or anybody's governance documents. Dave cleared the lane efficiently after each one, and nobody said a word about noise or emissions or aesthetic disruption. The lane was clean and passable within hours of each storm, and the neighborhood went about its winter business like normal people. I had my firewood, my functioning furnace, my propane topped off before Thanksgiving, my contract with Dave renewed, and my documentation folder in the filing cabinet in my home office. Everything in order. That's all you really need, honestly. The covenants on your side, the facts documented, a good plow guy, and the willingness to let the snow do the talking when someone forgets who actually keeps the lane open. 4 feet of snow has a way of making things very clear. Sherry completed her conditional period without incident, paid her fine, submitted the written apology to Dave's business, which Dave printed and framed in a small frame and hung in his shop, not out of cruelty but out of a sense of occasion, and resumed her role as a regular board member with significantly curtailed enthusiasm for unilateral rulemaking. By the second year after the blizzard, she had actually contributed constructively to a discussion about updating the HOA's communication policies, which Frank reported to me with an expression of genuine surprise. People can learn things. It's rare and it takes sometimes extraordinary circumstances, but it happens. Linda sent me a text the following February, on the 1-year anniversary of the blizzard, which I found both touching and completely in character for her. It said simply, 1 year since Maple Crest Lane was under 4 feet of snow, and we all survived it. Also, the new bylaws passed unanimously. Thought you'd want to know. I texted back a thumbs up and a snowflake. Outside my window that February afternoon, the sky was doing that thing again, that particular gray that means something is coming. I looked at it for a moment, checked the weather app, saw an incoming system with about 8 to 12 inches forecast overnight. Then I checked my phone for a text from Dave confirming he was on the route for tomorrow morning. He was. I put the phone down, put another log on the fire and settled in. Everything was exactly as it should be.